impacts because of limited finance. It's critical to bridge the financial gap to achieve the common national and global climate commitments. Humanitarian development and climate finance play a critical role in supporting recovery efforts in fragile and conflict-affected situations, notably climate fragile situations and contexts. I avoid to use the word countries, and the reason for that is that we do know that the climate fragility, conflict and all can be very localized. Climate change is one of the threats which could generate more conflict. Projections suggest that it will greatly increase the competition for scarce resources between groups and countries, which has been a traditional driver of violence and conflict. Poverty, crisis, conflict, environmental degradation are in fact intertwined challenges and need to be addressed holistically. This event will explore ways that humanitarian, development, and climate actors can strengthen and complement in adaptation, risk reduction, response, and development. It will demonstrate how concerted efforts of governments, development partners, and the private sector can lead to the design and implementation of actionable climate programs. Reducing climate vulnerability in rural communities through sustainable livelihoods is one of the core mandates of IFAD, aiming at reducing poor rural people's vulnerability to climate change, recover and conserve ecosystems and their services, and strengthening value chains and agricultural production systems. The United Nations Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, OCHA, in turn, helps coordinate the world's response to humanitarian emergencies. Through the Central Emergency Response Fund and country-based pooled funds, OCHA helps fund actions that minimize and respond to climate shocks. So we have brought together here today speakers not only from climate, development, humanitarian funds, but also from the private sector and from government. There is no better way to discuss ways to align finance and strengthen delivery. On behalf of the co-organizers, OCHA, IFAD, and all the colleagues and friends who are also joining us today, I would like to thank the distinguished speakers and panelists who have honored us today. And as our first speaker, I have the honor to invite Assistant Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs and Deputy Emergency Relief Coordinator, Joyce Msuya, for her opening remarks. Please join me in welcoming her.
Thank you very much. I'm honored on behalf of OCHA and the ISC mechanism to be here today to open this important meeting on aligning development, humanitarian, and climate finance. I want to thank IFAD, the World Bank, for partnering with OCHA on this event. And a very, very warm welcome and thank you to distinguished participants and to everyone who is attending this event today. Colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, as we have said on countless occasions, the climate crisis is without a doubt a humanitarian crisis. In the last 20 years, we have seen a staggering 800% increase in climate-related humanitarian appeals. Climate change is hitting the most vulnerable people first, worst, and longest. People, communities, and countries already weakened by violence, insecurity, political instability, economic inequality, and poverty. Climate change also further exacerbates the risks of conflict, adds to social and material loss and damage, and undermines development gains for people and communities who have contributed the least to the climate crisis. The humanitarian community is leading the response. Every year, between a quarter and a third of funds from the Central Emergency Response Fund goes to climate-related disasters. We are working very hard to adapt our approaches to the emerging status quo by committing more of our very limited resources to helping people ahead of predictable disasters through the anticipatory action. And we are incorporating more and more community resilience building into disaster responses, for example, through the distribution of drought-resistant seeds and promoting sustainable agriculture and water management practices. But I want to be clear about one thing. There is no humanitarian solution to the climate crisis. What the people and communities in the firing line of climate change desperately need are longer-term, transformational investments in mitigation, adaptation, and sustainable development. We need to work together to layer and integrate development, climate, and humanitarian funding, as well as the private sector finance, so that communities get holistic support to adapt to climate shocks, avert and minimize the impacts, and work towards and preserve development gains. To do this, we need to figure out how to work more coherently across development, humanitarian, and climate finance systems. Last year at COP27, in the outcome decision on funding arrangements for loss and damage, member states acknowledged that while there were many institutions and stakeholders involved in funding activities, existing arrangements fell short when it came to responding to current and future climate impacts. Identifying ways to ensure coordination and complementarity of climate funds with a broader mosaic of development and humanitarian finance remains absolutely critical. Today's meeting is an important opportunity to discuss how all of us, across the political, humanitarian, development, private sector, and beyond, can align our efforts to make this happen and get vital resources where they need to go. OCHA and the humanitarian community stand ready to play our part, to make better use of our pooled funding instruments alongside wider investments in development and adaptation, to share data and analysis on affected communities, and perhaps most importantly, to leverage the partnerships we have built with local people and organizations to ensure their needs and perspectives are the guiding force behind our efforts. The people I meet in crisis settings do not know or frankly care whether the assistance they receive is classed as climate, humanitarian, or development support. What they do know is they have a right to a life of hope and dignity in the face of a crisis they did so little to cause. And they know that we are currently failing them. Let us do better together. Let us get to work. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Msuya, for those remarks and for outlining the challenge we are here to discuss today. And also today, for those of you who do not know, it's the first time at COP that we have a day of relief, recovery, and peace. And I think there could be no better timing than for this topic today to be discussed. So thank you very much for sharing that. And yes, as you said, let's get to action. So our next speaker, I do not think needs any introduction. For those of you who are on the world stage, will know her, will know what she stands for. She is a visionary, and she is a champion for vulnerable communities. She is a champion for multilateral cooperation. And it does give me a great pleasure to introduce and to welcome Her Excellency Dr. Rania Al-Mashat, the Egyptian Minister of International Cooperation. Welcome, Dr. Rania.
Thank you, Dina, for the very warm welcome. And I want to thank IFAD and the World Bank for hosting this event. Sometimes we don't realize how climate action and climate change is so cross-cutting. If we're talking about humanitarian assistance, if we're talking about gender, if we're talking about education, health, etc., it's all really interrelated. And it just seems a few days ago that we were at COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh, and there we had very important discussions on the Loss and Damage Fund, and also bringing to the fore the importance of focusing on adaptation. And adaptation is really a very important key when we think about food security, which is required for vulnerable communities. And I can't find or think of better partners than IFAD on what you're doing with the small farmers in vulnerable communities, small communities, empowering them to be able to face more than one challenge, climate challenge, also availing what is required for humanitarian assistance. So, Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, it's a pleasure to be with you today. A very timely event, as I mentioned, to explore policies that put forward people at the forefront of our action agenda and leveraging international partnerships. Embedded in the 2030 Sustainable Development Agenda, combating climate change is now more urgent than ever. Dina had provided some statistics in her opening remarks, as we are already testifying its adverse impacts on people and planet. Although climate finance recently reached an all-time increase, we are still far behind. The stark imbalance between climate financing for mitigation and adaptation, with adaptation receiving only 4.9% of total climate finance, and this demands urgent attention. Tomorrow there's going to be the release of the global stocktake. That's going to be the highlight of COP28, and we're going to see the updated statistics on how much money has been making its way to adaptation. To achieve measurable change in the climate agenda, we need to multiply our financial resources and achieve distributional justice across regions and across sectors. Therefore, a transition to a low-carbon, climate-resilient pathway through just financing is necessary, which may include addressing issues of additionality of climate finance to existing and promised development finance flows to ensure the compatibility of global market instruments to developing country contexts. Today, I'm very happy to be representing the Egyptian government as we hosted COP27, which was an implementation COP, and we worked on pushing actions to move from pledges to implementation. Against this backdrop, we launched one of the presidential initiatives was the Sharm el-Sheikh Guidebook for Just Financing. This is the guidebook, and it's available online. IFAD was a key partner in the guidebook. And it's a practical manual which helps us scale up investments for climate action. For the first time, we have a definition of just financing that accounts for historical responsibility for climate change while ensuring equitable access to quantity and quality of climate finance, which supports resilient development pathways, leaving no one behind. And what's very important regarding the guidebook is that it fills an information gap for the national governments, investors, to reduce the risk and uncertainty associated with climate investments, and also provides modalities for blended finance, particularly on adaptation, because there's a misconception sometimes that adaptation is not profit generating for the private sector. And this is, in the guidebook, we have examples that IFAD has helped us put together of where the adaptation finance can actually crowd in private sector. And this is very, very much needed as we are trying to face humanitarian issues today. The guidebook also concludes with an actionable agenda for each stakeholder to be able to push forward the effectiveness and efficiency of the climate finance system. Another important initiative at COP27 was a country platform, Egypt's country platform for the nexus of water, food, and energy, the NOWEFI platform. And NOWEFI in Arabic means fulfilling pledges. And we're also very happy that the World Bank, IFAD, and many other partners are with us in this platform. It provides an opportunity for mobilizing climate finance and private investments to support the green transition, reflecting interlinkages and complementarity between climate action and development efforts. And this is also what was mentioned by the Assistant Secretary General when it comes to we need long-term solutions to solve short-term problems. If we just think about humanitarian assistance as short-term and trying to find the goods now, it puts away the need for medium to long-term durable solutions. And this can only happen if we do have climate finance that goes to meet country objectives, which are also in line with global objectives. So the NWAFI country platform sets a practical and replicable demonstration of country platforms. If you read the COP28, I don't know if it's a communique, but it's the finance framework, the new finance, the COP28 finance framework. There are two very important principles that underscore the importance of country platforms and the need to push them forward. So this is very much in line with what we have been doing. Also very important is that country platforms which have national projects of importance to the country can only be solved or only be tackled if there is private sector, if there is innovation through startups. And I also want to applaud IFAD for being our key partner on the food pillar of NWAFI. Together we have been organizing workshops to include private sector engagement within these projects, very, very much needed to be able to push forward. International cooperation and collaboration between the different stakeholders is the only way for us to move forward, and therefore the Conference of Parties, all parties are here to be able to discuss and work together to move ahead. With what's happening in the region today and the collaboration that's happening between OCHA and the Egyptian government is quite important, timely, and more is needed in the period ahead. I just conclude also with the first progress report of the NWAFI platform for those who are interested to basically see how on the food pillar, particularly on the water pillar, those that engage with different communities can be replicated to other countries. Thank you very much.
Your Excellency, Dr. Rania, thank you so much for that. And I just want to express, first of all, my thanks to you for your leadership and your championship, but also that of the government of Egypt for being on the driving seat of many of these initiatives and reforms, not just for Egypt, but I think for the global stage. More importantly, the models that you have mentioned, the NWAFI, I think is a replicable model. We already have many countries asking IFAD and asking the government to share this concept so that they can also replicate it. For also championing the just financing, nothing better than that. And also for really leading the way and showing us the way. And I think, as you said, it is in the communique for COP28, and we're looking forward for more of these to come. So I want to keep my intervention short because I'm so excited. There is such an interesting panel that will be coming, so please stay on. And I'm not just saying that to keep you in the room. It is going to be a very interesting panel coming up. So with that, also pleased here and honored to call upon Dr. Donal Brown. He's my boss, the Associate Vice President for IFAD programs. And he will be here also to basically to share with us his thoughts from the IFAD perspective and from also his own international experience. Dr. Brown, as you wish, if you'd like to take it from there or from here. And I really like this panel. It's so gender balanced. So again, another win for us.
Thank you, and good morning to everyone. What Dina said is not quite true. I seem to work for Dina most of my time, so I think nominally I'm her boss. So many thanks for this panel this morning. It's great to be on a panel with a good variation of views and experience, and it's really nice to be back with OCHA again. So I must say, when I looked at the panel title and I thought, what am I going to say here? I think the first thing probably is IFAD is not a humanitarian agency. Sometimes we get asked, including by our member states, to do humanitarian responses. It's not for us. We don't have the expertise. But where we can help is we do have the expertise around responding to shocks, but also trying to look at the long-term development perspective. And of course, I think we all know that money spent effectively on development saves money on spending on humanitarian, significant money later. I mean, one of the figures bandied around is every dollar spent on development saves $7 on humanitarian response. So we're a development finance institution. We have a very clear focus. We work on what I always like to call the first mile. A lot of people talk about it as the last mile, but for me, life begins at the end of the road, so it's the beginning of the road, not the end of the road. So we work with rural communities and small farmers to improve their livelihoods, to improve food security, and also to be able to improve smallholder food production. So that's our niche. And these are the people who are generally most affected by climate change and least able to cope with it. So that's why, for me, it's really important that our focus must be about building long-term resilience, but at the same time, we know in that context that we're going to get more and more shocks and crises. Some will need humanitarian responses, some will need more general responses to shocks, and that's where it's important that we work across that whole nexus. But central to this is the impact of climate change. And probably about 70% of IFAD's work is in contexts of fragility. So from my perspective, what we need is better coordination across development, climate finance, and climate and humanitarian finance. Better coordination for shocks, but better coordination that we try and prevent rather than respond. And in that role, as I say, IFAD sees itself as an assembler of finance. We go round with IFAD's core financing, trying to use that to leverage other forms of finance and blend it successfully together. At the same time, we have a number of special instruments, such as our rural poor stimulus facility response for COVID, the response that we put up for the Ukraine war, and we've built more flexibility within our general development programs and tried to ensure that we've got that flexibility. But really key for us is integrating climate finance into the core of our work. So for IFAD, 40% of all our core funding actually has to be climate attributable, but also we have special funds within that which we can use for innovation, for piloting, for coordination, for capacity building. And core to this whole process is partnerships. We're on a journey on partnerships with IFAD, moving from our kind of not only our core partnerships with government, but looking at core partnerships, particularly on how we can work together on better responses, but also on blending that finance together. So let me just give you 2 or 3 examples. One which we're particularly proud of is with BNDES, the Brazilian Public Development Bank, which we have launched a major program leveraging BNDES finance, GCF, and IFADs. It's the first time IFAD's done anything with a public development bank. It broke new ground for us. BNDES is so happy with it, they already want to replicate it. Another one, for example, is with the Green Climate Fund, but also with Finland, Nordic Fund, EU funding, and IFAD's funding on something which has just been approved by the GCF board, and I think we launched yesterday, called ARCAFIM, which is in 4 countries in East Africa. And it's channeling money through Equity Bank to small and medium enterprises and finance institutions to on-lend for adaptation activities at farm level, but at a level that's very affordable for small farmers. And we're really interested to see how that goes. But we're also looking at the humanitarian development peace nexus, trying to strengthen our partnerships with not only the UN, but particularly with some of the humanitarian actors in there. So, for example, with WFP, we have a flagship program, an FAO for the Sahel, which is using IFAD's core development finance to finance development activities and resilience building across the Sahel countries. Technical assistance on some of this from FAO, but the key partnership with WFP is to be able to work much more seamlessly when we have shocks and crises in that context, and using WFP's expertise, because we know that the Sahel is a very fragile area. So it's a regional program. It has challenges, because I think when you're trying to do financing across regions rather than within country, it brings its own challenges, and how you sort of build maybe the best sort of vision I have is a sandwich, a club sandwich with different layers in together so that it can work seamlessly. But it's also about sharing analysis, planning, logistics on that side of things. A second one is another one, the Africa Integrated Climate Risk Management Program, where we're working with the African Development Bank and WFP to look at smallholder resilience again across the Sahel region, but particularly looking at climate insurance and how we can do it. And just to finish with, I was asked a bit about innovation. I think there's innovation in partnerships, there's innovation in financing, but also I think what we're finding is increased use of technology is really helping us to be able to do this, and it links to the finance. So for being able to integrate things like spatial data, GIS, allows us to have much more predictable mechanisms for weather insurance payments, look at impacts of shocks, and makes these sort of instruments far more viable and far more sustainable. So maybe just in conclusion, I would say it's not just about innovating and coordinating on finance, but it's also about innovating and coordinating on partnerships and the sort of approaches that we do together. And for me, we often think at country level. We've got to get away from country level and think at regional level and cross-border level, which actually, as we're finding in IFAD, brings a whole new level of challenge. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Brown. And as you can see, this is a subject very close to his heart. And thank you for highlighting IFAD's approach to making finance accessible to smallholder farmers, but also not just the financing, but technologies, innovation, as well as how we leverage partnerships, not just for financing, but partnerships also for bringing these technologies to the front. So without further delay, I would like now to raise a question building on this and what you have heard. Our next speaker is Ms. Louise Cord, the Global Director for Social Sustainability and Inclusion at the World Bank. The World Bank has devised various instruments to enhance the climate resilience of food systems. And I would like to invite you to discuss how the World Bank perceives the way forward for aligning development, humanitarian, and climate finance, and what are you doing to innovate and better coordinate with other partners? Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the honor to be here today to address such an important topic. The intertwined nature of disasters, fragility, conflict, and violence suggests at the heart of it we need more coordination on these agendas. We cannot work, as has been said already, independently on the humanitarian, on the development, and on the climate fronts. They need to come together, these three strands. We also know that it is the most vulnerable countries and the most vulnerable groups within those countries that are the most impacted and face the greatest challenges on the development front. Yet data tells us that they receive the least amount of development assistance. On average, a person living in a fragile and conflict-affected country receives 2/3 less assistance than someone who's living in a low-income country. The World Bank, as you may know, has a large and expanding agenda on fragile and conflict-affected states. And in fact, today it's a big day for that work. FCV lending for us is up 3.5 times since 2012, reaching $22 billion in 2022. 40% of that is climate related, and it's roughly split equally between adaptation and mitigation. These are generally multi-sectoral investments covering institutions and policy reform and good governance, service delivery and infrastructure, agriculture and food security, and as well, what really matters when intervening in fragile and conflict-affected areas is how the assistance is provided. And we're increasingly providing this assistance directly to community levels, using, though, as was suggested before, regional approaches. So this idea of acting locally but thinking regionally. So an example of this is work to deliver assistance in the Sahel or in Lake Chad or the Horn of Africa or Bay of Guinea, where we have over $1 billion in commitments to deliver financing to local communities, which cover investments in agriculture, investments in basic infrastructure, but also investments in building cohesion and building groups together, bringing the pastoralists and the farmers together to discuss migration paths, bringing different ethnic minorities together, connecting communities to local governments to build better relations between the two and build trust and strengthen the social contract, which is so critical for the fragile and conflict-affected areas. So we're not only expanding our assistance, we're not only providing more multi-sectoral assistance, but we're also looking at how we provide that support and using integrated approaches and platforms for delivery at the community level. Clearly, food security is a key dimension of this work to address humanitarian, climate, and development challenges. People affected by food insecurity in developing countries is a key driver of fragility. And what we have seen in some countries that have exited fragility is that the agricultural sector was a leading sector in pushing countries out of their fragile state and putting them into expanding their development opportunities. And a good example of this would be Rwanda, which saw rapid agricultural sector growth as it left fragility. Yet, at the same time, financing for agriculture remains limited, and financing for agriculture in particular that looks at climate challenges and brings this integrated approach. Globally, 90% of financing is for mitigation, 10% only for adaptation at a global level. And out of that 10% for adaptation, which we've heard is so critical for agriculture, the need to build resilient food security systems that are going to be resistant to shocks, only a very small share of that 10% is dedicated to agriculture. Out of the 90% for mitigation, ironically, only 3% goes to agriculture globally. Yet we know that agriculture is a key actor both in terms of emissions, roughly 30% of carbon emissions come from the agriculture sector, suggesting that efforts are needed to help the sector transition to low carbon growth patterns. And also, even less is provided in terms of incentives to adopt agriculture or low carbon agriculture or climate-resistant agriculture. So very little is spent on the mitigation side, building incentives to transition the sector. With respect to what the World Bank is doing, since 2015 in the Paris Agreement, we have seen an increased financing, though, within the World Bank. There's been a 7-fold increase in our climate agricultural investments, which now reach $3 billion in 2023. Recently, we just published, it will come out in early next year, a publication called Recipe for a Livable Planet, How to Achieve Net Zero Emissions, which lays out very practical ways for high-income countries, middle-income countries, and low-income countries. What are the opportunities to transition to low-carbon agriculture? So clearly a publication to be looking out for. Yet, as I've been asked in this panel, coordination is key. It's great that the World Bank has expanded its agricultural and climate smart investments, but how are we doing this to coordinate with IFAD, other UN agencies, World Food Program, and bilateral programs? And this is a key part of what we're doing. And let me list 4 specific initiatives. First is the Global Food Security Program, or GAF-SP, as we call it. It's a financial intermediary fund supported by the bank, which is implemented by many UN organizations that's focused on building food security. It's provided 2 billion funds to reach 16 million people, offering financial and technical assistance, investment funds, concessional finance, and grants, so to support coordinated efforts around food security. Second, we've been working in 25 countries to develop country security food preparedness plans. With support from the IDA crisis window, these plans are being implemented by the FAO, WFP, UNICEF, to name a few agencies at the country level. In addition, we're partners with the G7 Global Alliance for Food Security, which aim to address some of the fragmentation and this lack of systemic approaches in addressing food crises. It was launched in 2022 to address the global food crisis and food security needs. It was convened by the World Bank Group and the G7 presidency of Germany, with active support from humanitarian and development partners. And the aim is to improve coordination in responding to food security crises. Finally, let me just mention 2 other approaches in our disaster risk management work program and in our community development program, which I think are relevant to enhancing coordination. Just quickly, these are a shift that we've seen in recent years to going from ex-post responses to crises to better preparedness up front and investment in prevention, which helps right there create a framework which is needed then to draw on in the moment of crisis across development actors. A good example of this is the work that we're doing in the Democratic Republic of Congo to strengthen early warning systems and support to the meteorological organization, which we're doing together with other partners. We're also, though, continuing our efforts to provide better support once crises hits. We're engaging in the Libya rapid diagnostic and needs assessment to respond to the floods that happened in 2023 in September earlier this year, working together with the EU and the UN on carrying out this diagnostic. And then finally, these platforms for community intervention at the local level, which go through government financial systems, fiscal systems down to the local government to reach communities, which allow for integrated approaches and facilitate co-financing across donors. Thank you.
Really very, very important information that you have shared with us and packed a lot of this, you know, the statistics that we always hear, but really it's fascinating. And I just want to recognize the World Bank has been a fierce partner and really pushing many of us to really recognize the importance of this work. So thank you again for that. Now I'd like to call upon our last speaker, but this doesn't mean it's the last of the session. As I said, we still have a lot of exciting things coming up. I'd like to invite Mr. Henry Gonzalez, the Deputy Executive Director of the Green Climate Fund, who will discuss the role of climate finance in helping mitigate and adapt to climate change. So, Dr. Gonzalez, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. First of all, on behalf of the Green Climate Fund, we are honored to be here along our partners. The GCF is a partnership organization. We work through entities that have been accredited, among them IFAD and the World Bank. So I feel indeed with a lot of company. But most importantly, we are a country-driven fund. So it's great to have here Madam Minister, because we work with the countries. We try to understand what are the priorities of the countries and the regions and where the Green Climate Fund could come in to help realize those ambitions. We're very honored that at in the previous COP, we worked with Egypt on this climate investment platform, and we're very happy to see that coming through. Now, we are a COP-mandated fund, and we have a mandate to do an equilibrium between adaptation and mitigation at 50% each grant equivalency. At the same time, we get guidance from COP that in the adaptation, we should at least dedicate 50% to the most vulnerable. And most vulnerable is particularly small island development states, least developed countries, and African states. I'm very glad to report that as we are finishing our first programming cycle, we've dedicated 63% of our adaptation funding to the most vulnerable. And through our partners like IFAD and others, we're also trying to reach those in the rural communities that are indeed facing that. Now, GCF has several windows, and we hope that through our funding windows with our partners, that is over 200, we're able to reach better and program better. We have one window which is extremely important. It is our readiness window, where we have already made more than $500 million in grants. This is designated by our NDAs, our national designated authorities, based on their priorities. We are launching a new strategy that the board approved in the previous board meeting in Georgia, where we're going to also try to do multi-country readiness and multi-year readiness. So instead of just doing year by year, we are allowing countries to use up to $4 million per programming cycle, and they could also explore working in programmatic approaches for readiness. And I think that this is an important element because readiness is there to do the policy de-risking, to align some of those barriers that is not allowing funding to come into countries. So we hope that with this new strategy, we're going to be able to do that better. We also have a new, another window, which is the project preparation facility. We've realized, and this is something that it's our priority, and our new executive director, Mafalda Duarte, who sends her best regards, she coincidentally is currently part of the Early Warning for All, which is an important initiative where GCF is also playing a role. We would like to improve access. We've heard from our partners that access in GCF needs to change. And this is one of the mandates of our new strategy, but we are also trying to provide ways of improving access. And one of those is the project preparation facility. We are now, we were able to increase the amount, and we would like to work with our partners when entities, especially direct access entities, require more support, we're able to help them better. We're able to also help build in capacities, because indeed one of the things we want to do is we want to be more than just the capital and the funding we provide. We want to help also building those capacities in order for them to improve how they do it. Lastly, our funding proposals. We want to, as I said, be more streamlined, more efficient, especially as we work with the most vulnerable. Mafalda was recently attending the Pacific Islands Forum in Cook Islands. And while GCF has been able to provide funding across all the 15 islands on readiness, we have to improve how small islands, development states access our funding at the debt or grant level. The last thing I'd like to somehow bring is we are a true catalytic blended finance provider. We have that flexibility that we can go from grants to subordinated loans to equity to guarantees to bonds. So that flexibility is one that we really want to make sure that through our partners, we are indeed crowding in public and private sector. But we're only 3% of the 100 billion expectation per year, because we do program around $3 billion a year. You probably heard yesterday the US just pledged for our next replenishment. So with that new pledge and others that we've heard in the past few days here at COP, for GCF2, which is the programming that goes from 2024 to 2027, we've got around $12.5 billion. We're very grateful to our contributors, but it's not yet the trillions. Now, how do we use this finite capital with the flexibility that we have, because our board has given us a high-risk mandate? How do we use that in order to really crowd in, test new models, use innovations, create the proof of principle, and then allow others to scale them forward? So this is a big mandate. We're very, very excited because we're starting that new cycle, but we really want to make sure that climate, development, and humanitarian is not as fragmented, that is a lot more coordinated. Other speakers have mentioned that. And we look forward to strengthening our partnership with governments, with the private sector, and also with the multilateral and UN agencies, but we're going to put a lot of emphasis on direct access entities. Entities are country that understand the realities of those that are the most vulnerable. We really want to serve them better. So thank you for this opportunity and looking forward to continuing the discussion.
Thank you very much, Dr. Gonzalez, for those insightful remarks, but also very interesting that you're thinking about these, in a more integrated way, the blended, how do you crowd in? Because as we heard from Luis, at the end, only 3% goes to agriculture. So we need to see all these partners coming together, really pushing forward to leverage more. And the de-risking, the policy de-risking, I think is an extremely important area to bear in mind. Because we heard from the speakers before, a good project, a well-prepared project is already half the solution for success. So we're looking forward to working more with the GCF and other partners. Now, I would like to transition to the next session. Many thanks to all the speakers, but please do not leave because for giving us a taste of the work and priorities of climate development and humanitarian funds. And I'd like to use the remaining time first to actually provide a visual illustration of some of the action on the ground. And as you heard from Dr. Rania, of the NUAFI program, the Nexus of Water, Food and Energy. So we'd like to also showcase some of these work where when we work together, things can happen. So please, the video.
اسمي فادية محمد إبراهيم مسعود. دلوقتي الحمد لله بساعد جوزي في مصاريف البيت. أولادي بنعلمهم تعليم حلو. بنتي دخلتها تمريض ثانوي، يعني اتغيرت فرق السما من الأرض.
الطاقة الشمسية فرقت معانا لأن بتوفر لنا في الوقود، وطبعا بيحافظ على البيئة في حتة الانبعاثات وثاني أكسيد الكربون والكلام ده. بالنسبة لري بالتنقيط وفر لي في الأسمدة والمبيدات وفي معالجة الأرض من الأمراض التربة، وعشان نحقن المواد دي غالية، ما ينفعش نحقنها في ري غمر. بس هو لازم ان هو يكون في مصدر ميه ثابت عشان الطاقه دي بتشتغل يوميا، فلازم انا مصدر للطاقه ثابت ما يكونش فيه تكلفه عاليه.
Egypt's country platform for the Nexus of Water, Food and Energy, pronounced in Arabic as NUAFI, which means fulfilling pledges, is a platform which brings together different stakeholders.
NUAFI is a flagship program for the government of Egypt and is expected to leverage both public and private sector financing and best practices to support Egypt's plans for a green transition.
بالنسبة لتطوير الري الأشجار أو المحاصيل العقلية بيدي إنتاجية أعلى، عائد مالي كبير، تخفيض في العمالة. بدل ما برش حشائش كل مثلا 15 يوم مرة، هرش في الشهر مرة.
IFAD has proven its capacity as an assembler of finance, and this latest role in leading the food pillar of the NUAFI country platform, where it will bring together, of course, on-farm water efficiency, looking at also agricultural productivity and enhancing, of course, agricultural best practices, bringing in digital technologies and also renewable energies as a source of transformation.
أنا مسؤولة هنا عن شبكة الأرصاد في ال3 قريات، بلف على المزارعين بدخل منها البيانات، الرقم القومي، الاسم، رقم التليفون، عنده كام فدان، وبروح مدخلهم على الشبكة، بيوصل لهم رسائل إرشادية على الموبايل.
أكتر حاجة استفدنا في التغيرات المناخية اللي هي رسائل الإنذار المبكر، اللي هي كانت الرسالة بتجيلنا قبلها بيوم، إن أنت مثلا بكرة في إيه؟ دي طبعا كانت بتفيدني، أنا كانت بتجيني الرسالة الجو بكرة كذا، فما كنتش بعمله، كنت بأجله أو بشوف له بديل إن أنا كده. هي الرسائل دي اللي كانت نافعانا إحنا في التغيرات المناخية.
Another important aspect of NUAFI is that it's a nexus. So the relationship between energy, water, and food is fulfilled, and that's fulfilled because there's geographic distribution across different governorates of Egypt.
The food pillar has 5 projects, and we have already started designing the first one, which is the crown, and it will be covering 8 governorates in Upper Egypt, reaching about 6 million people. 40% of whom are women and 30% are expected to be youth.
المنحة اللي أنا قدام الإفادة أنا استفدت منها كتير بسبب الندوات اللي كانوا بيعملوها لنا. كنت بربي باسم بربي وخلاص، دلوقتي أنا بحسب له. يعني مثلا أنا ربيت، أنا وكلت، شربت، لازم أعمل حساب كل حاجة، أعرف أنا صرفت إيه واستفدت إيه ووفرت إيه وبصرف على بيتي بإيه. اللي يطلع من الأرض بنفرموه على مخلفات البهايم بنسمده الأرض. أنا ما بحتاجش إن أنا أشتري أي أسمدة من بره.
When we talk about climate change, we want to leave no one behind. And leaving no one behind means that small farmers come in as a priority.
There's not been a time when climate action, water and food security have not been top priorities. And we're urging on global leaders to take action now, because the cost of inaction means we either starve or die. Thank you, and I think I do not need to elaborate more because the video speaks for itself, and it really, when you hear from those who are on the ground themselves and what they have to really go through is enough evidence that we need to do more. So with that, ladies and gentlemen, we are now transitioning to the fireside chat. I'm not going to be as liberal with the time, although I'm sure we could love to spend the whole day here. But I would like to first introduce the panelists, in addition to the ones we have on the stage. The first is Lieutenant General Inam Haider Malik, the chairman of the National Disaster Management Authority from Pakistan. Welcome. Thank you for being with us. I'd also like to introduce Ms. Alice Armani Seki, director of the Pooled Fund Management Branch at OCHA. Again, welcome. And last but not least, Dr. Eugene Williamson. He is the CEO for Africa, Middle East, and South Asia from PepsiCo. So with that, ladies and gentlemen, I will move right to the fireside chat, and I would like to set my first question to Lieutenant General Inam Haider Malik. I will invite you to the stage, but as I invite you, I would like you to share your experience on how Pakistan has been tapping into climate and disaster risk financing windows to forward your resilience, your country's resilience agenda. Welcome.
Thank you very much, and we're very grateful for this opportunity to present Case Pakistan as a study of reference and then find out that what all we could have done and what all we need to take the best out of the climate risk financing availabilities and opportunities that are there for developing countries around the globe. We are also aware of learning from our last year's floods of 2022, which was one of the devastating in all of the recorded history of the floods and other disasters. We have been through a colossal loss of over $30 billion in the economy, and then over about 2,000 people losing their lives. We are aware that these are not the only ones, and they are all unprecedented, more devastating floods and disasters which are appearing around the globe every year and every month. So that makes our global response to have a more holistic overview and a mid-course correction, which we have been forecasting for not only the SDGs and other frameworks of the globe, but also looking at the good global practices at what all we need to do from this point onwards. Risk financing as an instrument which has been largely inaccessible to largely the developing states and the vulnerable communities which were there for these disasters. I think the alternate is to respect the science and let's start doing some innovative mechanisms for these regionalized disasters in management portfolio. We anticipate that there's a growing fatigue on the donors' perspectives, and there is a stress which is too quickly swaying the global attention from one disaster to the other. So it will become largely difficult for the donors and developed world to partner and support all these initiatives which a country would require or would need. in case Pakistan, the global risk financing has largely been underutilized, and we had not been able to gain that due access to like Green Climate Fund and carbon credits. But I guess these are the times when what all we do, which have to be leveraged against our states' capability and all these vulnerable states' capabilities and capacities to claim their rightful place in their risk financing systems and initiatives. While we are now investing into the more resilience-based communities and responses around the country, we are looking at enabling people to rise on their own feet and help on their structures to have a reasonable, sustained indigenous resilience embedded into their responses. Now, that would come from two basic ideas of first, making a collage of all the knowledge that we have on these disasters, putting our academia into in action, and then have their input in making those policies recommendations for not only the risk financing instrument, but also the large-scale investments and into resilience. Second, by proactive modeling and initiatives which are going to have a reasonable trajectory of our future disasters in place. Now, that would also enable communities to at least have our pre-planned identification of our disasters, and then predetermined calculations of these pre-needs, which can be shared with our donors and partners alike. I think that will also significantly reduce the burden on the risk and investments magnitude that would be required after every major disasters. Now, we anticipate that there has to be a logical conclusion of this risk financing, because we must improve and evolve and adapt in time. And as we are reaching to that excellence, we should gradually be decreasing the quantum of the risk financing which is required and increasing the indigenous capacities of the states to help those initiatives which can take on most of these initiatives on their own. Now, the reliance of the vulnerable communities or the struggling economies on the disaster risk financing has also been very questionable, because it has not allowed the state to recover from the developmental challenges and then also pay back the interest on those very hefty loans. Now, for vulnerable communities and countries, I would say that it would be important for these countries to have an idea on their predictive disaster modeling, and then helping their own indigenous-based solutions to respond to multitude of these disasters, including the private sector and the communities at large. We have been devising this proactive modeling and the proactive disaster management in Pakistan, and we would like this to have our global goal when we are contributing towards review in the major disaster risk reduction policies and frameworks around the world. We would like to have our communities involved into it, because a large-scale Green Pakistan initiative has been launched, which is maximizing the food security agricultural product of Pakistan. And we understand that while we are looking at vulnerable communities, there's a lot that can be done with least amount of global financing on risks. That would include not only the value additions in the food security domain, but also on capitalizing the indigenous capability of the private sector and the local producers to take part of most of the resilience that would come from these global centers. So I guess these disasters would never come alone. They would create second-order disasters, third-order disasters like internal displacements, and then creating massive debts for the struggling economies, which are not sustainable. And if they're not sustainable, obviously the next round of disaster management will also create more amount of dependencies on the risk financing instruments. So I guess our strategy should focus on reducing these dependencies and creating the inherent indigenous capacities of the states to come and resolve much on their own. For that, the investment should go into academia, to the intellectual discourse, to cross-pollinate the global good practices from one zone to the other, and then having a connectivity of all these technological centers of predictions, modeling, and creating those informed education-based or the models that have been tested around the globe. They can be customized for all these regions, and then we can come up with a solution that can help that community to stand up on its own feet and reduce its dependencies on the risk investments. After Pakistan's floods in last year, 2022, we have raised our capacity to projectize and then prepare those proposals which can create an interim support from global climate fundings streams. But in the long term, we would try to reduce it as much as we can, and we would try to become more participative in the regional approach to the disaster management and look at our capacities to predict our disasters well in time, which is based on disasters modeling platforms, and as I said earlier, the collage of all academia knowledge on this subject. Thank you.
Lieutenant General Malik, really fascinating what you're doing, and I couldn't agree more that we need to all also look at how this interdependency and also just relying on always external support when there's a lot of knowledge, a lot of resources at community level and indigenous level, but at the same time, also, as you said, having a regional strategy but a very clear roadmap. So very, very interesting information there. And again, well, again, an example of a country really driving its own, agenda and being on, a champion for that. So again, thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, I will now move to Dr. Williamson, who has been quite patient throughout, the CEO of PepsiCo. And I would like to ask you, you've been listening to all these multilaterals and governments, and so from the private sector, how do you think you can leverage the private sector's finance in innovative ways to support these type of projects, climate projects? And how would you, is the solution, if there's one solution or several solutions, to partner with the development and bilateral, actors? Welcome.
Thank you to all the panelists, and of course Your Excellency for opening the session as well with the great work that you're doing in Egypt, and we're proud to partner with you in Egypt specifically. So for those of you that are not familiar with PepsiCo, we're the second largest food and beverage company globally, and as such we also believe that agriculture is actually one of the probably most underleveraged tools that we have to address climate change. We're also very happy in that regard that yesterday the Emirates Declaration came out, which focuses very much on creating sustainable agriculture, resilient food systems, and of course addressing climate change. We, as PepsiCo, have announced 2 years ago a very ambitious program that aims at transforming the food system and, of course, supporting that across the world. We work with about 100,000 farmers globally, and in the division that I'm leading, which is Africa, the Middle East, and Asia, we work with about 40,000 farmers. So just in India alone, 27,000 farmers that we interact with. As such, we also believe that we have the opportunity, but also the responsibility to leverage agriculture as a means to address climate change. And we're doing that by converting the equivalent of all the land that we're using, which is about 7 million acres globally, to regenerative agricultural practices. We've also started doing that in the Africa, Middle East, and the South Asia region. I would say that that is a challenge. It is a challenge because we're working with many small-scale farmers. And of course, when you work with small-scale farmers, it's much more challenging to put technology into place that actually helps drive this transition to regenerative agriculture. Now, what we've been doing is, over the last couple of years, invest in smart technologies, such as drip technology. You've seen some of that also on the video. We have that currently in place both in Egypt as well as in India and in Pakistan. But we're also partnering with institutions such as the CARE Foundation and USAID with a very specific focus on creating more resilient communities. So what we've done in Egypt in partnership with CARE, we've launched a program which is called She Feeds the World. Egypt was the first country to pilot that program. It specifically focuses on female farmers. And with those female farmers, we've done a couple of things that actually helped create a thriving farming community. And I actually visited that farming community, I think it was earlier this year in January, in Ben Suef. What we did there is, first of all, provide soft loans to these farmers, provide them also with off-take agreements for the potatoes that we need for our potato chips that we produce in Egypt, but also help with clear skills transfer. And then also help put in place some of the technologies such as drip irrigation that also helps preserve water usage. That has been a very, very successful program that we're now expanding across many countries across the world. So we're doing that, for instance, in Uganda. You mentioned that you came back actually from Uganda this morning, so that's another country in which we have that program now up and running. And we also expanded it to other places in the world, in Latin America and Southeast East Asia. That is just one example. Another example is what we're doing in India as well as in Pakistan, and that's in partnership with USAID. Again, that focuses also very much on female farmers, similar to the program that we're doing with the CARE Foundation. In India, that's focused on West Bengal. In Pakistan, it's in Gilgit. And again, the objective there is through financing, through skills transfer, as well as through offtake agreements, help create thriving communities, but also communities that produce the crops that we need in a sustainable way. Now, obviously, with the amount of agricultural land that we currently use, we need other stakeholders to come on board to help us drive that transition. And I think as such also, we're currently in discussion with a couple of international finance and development organizations to see how we can accelerate that transition. And that is, for us, of course, critical given the commitment that we have to complete this journey by 2030. So we have another 6 years roughly to go. Yeah, as I said, we need other stakeholders to help us drive that transition. So for us, count on us as an actor to lean in. Count on us also as an actor that will drive the transition, but of course we cannot do it alone. We need other stakeholders to come on board. So thank you so much for the opportunity.
Thank you so much. And for those who have been saying private sector are not interested because it's too expensive or costs too much, you can hear directly from PepsiCo that they're doing a lot of exciting and very, I think, impactful work on the ground. So there is a lot of scope there. So with that, I'd like now to transition to the next speaker. And now I'd like to call on Luis again. You know, you've just heard again from Dr. Williamson, but you heard also from the Lieutenant General here. How do you think the World Bank can make bankable projects in context of fragility?
Thank you very much. A really easy question, so I'm really happy to take it. And I'll be very brief, how's that, for answering. The World Bank has introduced 6 new global programs, one of which is on food security. And the aim of the global program on food security is to move from where we're providers of finance to where we're facilitators of finance. And one of the key objectives of that role, moving to be a facilitator, is how can we do more to de-risk agriculture, to de-risk the country context, to allow for more and expanded investment from the private sector so that we can crowd in private sector investments. So that's through, obviously, public good investments, it's through enhanced digital access to supported services such as financial inclusion, but it's also the work that we're doing on, sort of, as I mentioned earlier, on community infrastructure. But it's also something where I'd actually like to hear from Dr. Williamson, you know, when we're talking about de-risking, which, you know, this is a brand new program that the World Bank just introduced with the objective of really facilitating significant increases in global investment for agriculture with a climate smart focus and crowding in other partners. What are some of the key constraints that you would see that the World Bank can contribute? Because we're in the process right now of designing this program. So thank you.
't you very much, and I love the way you flipped the question back to the private sector. So let me give Dr. Williamson a chance to respond to that. Please, Dr. Williamson.
Yeah, so from a PepsiCo standpoint, I think as I said, the opportunity for us is to leverage our skill, yeah? And that is something that we absolutely are doing and also intend to do even more. But I think also we have an opportunity to convene given the skill that we have. And from our side, you can count on us to lean in, but also to help create ecosystems to help address some of these fundamental challenges that we're facing. Now, there is, I think, in agriculture, a lot that we can do, but we cannot do it. We really cannot do it alone. Yeah? So There is, of course, suppliers that provide input into the agricultural value chain that we're working with to come on board, but also the financing. Some of that obviously can come from the private sector, but I think there's also an opportunity to leverage financial institutions, whether that be commercial financial institutions or whether that be development financial institutions. Let me just give you one example. So if you just think about the cost to convert farming to complete regenerative agricultural practices, that costs money initially. And of course, the transition needs some support from a financing standpoint. There is, I think, an opportunity, and the CEO of Lloyd's yesterday in a panel actually referenced that opportunity to provide, in this case then, insurance to farmers as they transition to regenerative agricultural practices. Now, with offtake agreements from companies like ours, there is also an income stream that backs that up. So I think that is just one very concrete example where potentially through a combination of a company like ours, a big financial institution, working with farmers, you can accelerate that transition. Now, I think in the case of small-scale farmers, it is more complicated, and because in some cases also it's more complicated for these farmers to have access to financing. Now, that's where we can help, but obviously that's also where international financial development institutions can help. And this morning, I won't disclose the name, but we had a conversation, bilateral conversation also with a big bank to see how potentially they could support that effort as well, especially for small-scale farmers.
Okay, thank you very much for that. So now I'd like to move to Alice from OCHA. So Alice, so you're hearing about, you know, the investments with smallholders, and it's probably more difficult because they don't have all the access and they don't have all the capacities. How does the humanitarian system then coordinate finance with development and humanitarian actors? If you could share some thoughts on that, since you're there pooling all these funds together, please.
Thank you so much, and I'll first apologize for the sound of my voice, which I seem to have lost somewhere between New York and Dubai. But thank you for the chance to share reflections, and good to be with you all in Your Excellency. Yes, it's quite the challenge in front of us. I think Joyce alluded to some of that, but we do need to come together. And I want to reiterate the value of development investments to help reduce humanitarian needs. I think linking humanitarian development and climate is not only important, it is now time critical as we address the issues, the impact of climate change, and also the growing effect it's having on the most vulnerable communities. From our perspective, there's 4 areas of potential collaboration at the country level. First is sharing our risk analysis, coming together across these ecosystems to look at data, to look at historical data, to share what we know about recurrent crises, about hazards, and to come to a shared analysis of the risks. The second is aligning our strategic planning. We have, of course, the national adaptation plans. We have the UN Sustainable Development Cooperation Frameworks, and from a humanitarian perspective, we have humanitarian response plans. So there's a real opportunity as we develop our planning to align it. The third is financing, and we can refer to the club sandwich around ensuring layered and complementary financing. And I work in the area of pool funds, so obviously that's where a lot of my attention goes. And then the fourth is joined up programming, very simply, at the lowest local level to ensure that we get the recipe right for the people that we're trying to reach. And I think we're really very conscious that if we put people at the center of our programming, we will be able to provide a response that is more coherent and efficient across these different areas of work. If I can just speak briefly to what OCHA is doing in this regard, I think the first thing we're doing is getting ahead of crises and not, to avoid being as surprised by them as we've been in the past. Working at the country level to identify hazards, to identify triggers, and identify data that tells us that if the rain continues, there will be a flood. and we can actually predict how bad the situation will get based on historical data. So we identify the triggers, we identify an early response, but we also pre-agree to financing. But by doing all of this work ahead of time, as has been said, we really have established a platform for easier and better collaboration, I think, across the development and climate areas of work. So the Central Emergency Response Fund, which is the UN Secretary General's response fund for emergencies, is currently the largest financier of what we call anticipatory action. And in this work, what we're trying to do is bring in others. And if we come together and identify the hazards that will likely lead to a disaster, it only makes sense to try and prevent that disaster, not through humanitarian funding, but in collaboration with government and development and climate actors. The other thing we're doing is putting our pooled funds to work on the humanitarian side. As Joyce mentioned, our pooled funds give about a third to a quarter of their resources annually, around $2 billion under management. About a quarter of that to a third goes to climate-related disasters. What we realize as well is that we need to continue being more nimble and more flexible as we do that. And going back to this discussion around regional approaches that are locally anchored, we're actually looking at establishing regional pooled funds that help us respond to crises there where they arrive, where they happen in a more flexible manner. And last but not least is partnership. I think it's a journey. There's a lot more that can be done, and I hope today's discussion helps us take a big step forward in that direction. But I think for us, partnership starts at the local level, particularly with those local civil society actors that are in the communities serving the people. And so we've been working a lot to enhance that partnership with these local actors, not only as implementers of the delivery of aid, but as real partners with enormous insight in the needs of their communities. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much for that. And I think most of us would agree that the 4 areas that you pointed out are extremely important, and that, as everyone has said, partnerships are essential if we're going to move ahead with actually achieving this objective. I just want to go back to something that was said by Dr. Gonzalez, and very quickly, because I see we're running out of time, so I haven't been very good with sort of stopping everyone, because it's been very interesting. But given the high cost of humanitarian action, and we heard, I mean, it's justified when you hear Alice, but in GCF, you talked about these billions, multi-billion, multi-year programming. How do you see GCF prioritizing the work that we do to building stronger resilience? You talked about project preparation, policy resilience, and all that. How do you see that really as your priority? Is it in the preparedness, or is it then in trying to react and rebuild and reconstruct and rehabilitate? Thank you.
Thank you very much. And it was great to hear also the gentleman from Pakistan, as we heard before, because here we have a case where GCF setup does not have an immediate response. And we're not able to work in the loss and damage component of addressing, just because our setup and our governance. But we can later come in at a moment where others have already come and we can follow and take it to the next level. So given the floods and everything that happened in Pakistan last year, we joined the meeting in Geneva, and with the World Wildlife Fund, we were able to create a program called Recharge Pakistan, and we gave a $66 million grant to work on that recovery phase. So I think that sometimes it's important to understand what's the value added of the different players, and make sure that we have like a discipline and a coordinated action that we come where we are able to come. GCF can work a lot on the minimizing and averting, so we can work on early warning systems, we can work on some of those, and we're doing that, but on the response, we're not there yet. Now, we've had dialogues with OCHA, and we have dialogues with others, especially through the Secretary General of the UN, who would like us to work better. I believe there is appetite, but we do need to see what funding modalities we would need to have that will create that flexibility. And we believe that, now that the Loss and Damage Fund has been created, we would like to contribute, because now we're going to have another fund where we need to be better at coherence and complementarity. The same that we're trying to do with the adaptation fund, with Jeff, and now with the loss and damage fund. Thank you.
Thank you. No, and it's good you brought that up, because I think this is going to add another complexity to all the partnerships that we try to manage. Dr. Brown, how can we seek more complementarity, taking from what Dr. Gonzalez said in this, HDP nexus? The lines are a bit blurred. So how do you see this complementarity happening?
Thank you. Thank you. So I think complementarity is one issue, but I think we still need more finance, and we shouldn't be forgetting that. But we do need to make it work better, and it's clear that we need more climate finance. There is some work which basically shows that the most fragile countries receive the less or the least climate finance, and they are the most affected. So only one of the top 15 recipients of climate funds is actually extremely fragile in terms of countries. And when you measure it per capita, extremely fragile states get about $2 per person, compared to fragile states which get about 10, and non-fragile states which get $160 per person. So firstly, we need more climate finance going to those most affected, where we see the impact of the shocks and the crises. Then obviously we need more complementarity. I'd like to take it from a slightly different angle on this. Actually, and it goes to something that our colleague from the Green Climate Fund said, the main issue we often find is actually the capacity in many of our partner governments. So you can talk about complementarity all you like, but if there isn't capacity and coordination at the level where the money is being used, then it really doesn't matter what's happening. And I think we focus too much on international level. So, how do we build that capacity and complementarity and coordination with our recipient partners? And often it's the most fragile context where there's least capacity. And I think, for someone like IFAD, we work at country level. We try and integrate the different sources of funding. We can bring funding in, say, with Ministries of Agriculture and Rural Development, but then we find we can get no traction in Ministries of Environment to actually complement the climate funding coming through GEF, GCF, etc., with the other funding that's coming in. So I think there's a real issue there. And when we see really strong leadership, like in Egypt with Nawafi, it becomes very much easier to put that complementarity in the funding together. And then, as I said in the previous intervention, I think partnerships are key to all this. And it's not just partnerships about the complementarity of the different funding sources, but actually we've got to start from how do we do joint analysis, how do we do joint planning, and how do we do joint responses. Very often, I think if we're honest, you see competition, not coordination for limited resources of money. And we need to move away from that. And having worked in a bilateral agency, I think as donors, we need to take responsibility for promoting competition when we say we're actually trying to get coordination. Plethoras of instruments, plethoras of initiatives that fragment. And I think, just to finish, key to all this is bringing in the private sector. And it's not just because my friend from PepsiCo is sitting next to me, but I think IFAD is finding more and more the partnerships with the private sector are becoming some of the most interesting and transformative. And it's not the private sector as almost subcontractors of us, it's actually as equal partners. And how do we find those right instruments for working together? And I would get away from just the PepsiCos of this world, because I think, when I think about it, one of the things IFAD has is an initiative on remittances, and remittances in Africa. You look at the resources available, and I'm sure it's the same in Egypt, that's there on remittances. How do you harvest those sorts of resources and put them to work in this context? Because actually that's really, really liberating. And we've done some really interesting work in countries like Somalia, when you look at the remittances there, that will never come through formal systems to actually, and actually they're really interested in investing back into things like adaptation in communities. So I would kind of leave that as the sort of final challenge on there. Thank you.
Thanks very much, and that really resonates with everything that's been said. And I'm going to open the floor very shortly, but I just wanted to hand to Her Excellency. You're a big advocate for just transition, and you've been listening into all this. And what would be the three main challenges in this context of fragility and conflict? What are the three main challenges you see for a just transition?
If we start on the challenges, we will get discouraged.
Opportunities.
So let's think of things that worked. And one of the very important points is to always mention what has worked, try and advocate for it so that we can scale, because this is very important. But I want to do a bit of a reflection on the speakers, if you allow me, Dina. And Donal had mentioned that there needs to be capacity and commitment from the government side before we talk about complementarity and finance. And I think this is very important. And that's why commitment from governments is key. And also trying to address the regulatory and sort of the policy angle to be able to leverage on what each partner can provide. So this is very important. The second point is on the private sector. And I want to really applaud PepsiCo for what they're doing in Egypt and in other regions, but Egypt because the place we know the most in my case. And it's really opening up the doors for the small farmers. And this is related to value chains. It's also related to the standards for the agriculture itself. And here comes the point where IFAD, even though it's a small institution, but it's very impactful because this concept of leaving no one behind becomes very tangible. Because sometimes also with the public, when they say you're going to COP and everybody's talking about leaving, what do you mean? And really having or demonstrating what real programs can do on the ground is quite key. And this is an example of where the private sector is playing a role and continues to play a role. And it's up to all of us to try and see how these programs can be scaled in more governorates in other countries and so forth. I want to benefit from the presence of GCF and the World Bank and advocate for the project that we're working on with IFAD for the NWEFI program, which is CROWN. And here we need, not just the financing, but also how we can work together to create the concessional, more concessional elements, particularly related to some of the capacity building and so forth. So we're going to be coming to see how we can advertise for all this and push the message push the message forward. And then finally, it's very important that governments are able to understand the comparative advantage of each development partner and create an environment where they can work together to reduce the competition that Donald was talking about. And that's why country platforms are so important. I keep on mentioning them just because it is a way to maximize the goodwill that exists in all of these meetings, where everyone wants to contribute to push the agenda forward, but these platforms create a practical way, an operational way for access. For you mentioned what is it with the just transition? It's access to finance, it's the affordability of finance, and then this concept of additionality. So even though we're doing development finance, but when we are looking at climate elements, this should be additional to what, and I mean the evolution of the World Bank is going on. We've done plenty, and there's more on the agenda. So I think these are some of the points to conclude. Why is NWEFI, in our point, successful with all partners? There's commitment from the government, there's clarity with respect to the projects, and there's credibility with all our partners. We've been able to deliver before, and we want to continue delivering with the partners, including, of course, the private sector.
Thank you very much, Dr. Rania, and really a lot of insightful remarks there, and I totally agree. But we will not be doing justice to this event if we do not hear from the youth themselves. We've heard from government, we've heard from multilaterals, we've heard from the private sector, but we need to have the youth's voice as well. And I have the honor really to introduce to you and to invite to the stage Nasreen Assaim, who was the former chair of the UN Secretary General's Youth Advisory Group on climate change. Nasreen, thank you for joining us.
Ladies and gentlemen, I need to inform you that the time has elapsed. I'm sorry.
Okay. Well, my name is Nisrina Saim, and I'm from Sudan. And I think...
I'm sorry, I need to interrupt you. We don't have more time. We have the next side event outside waiting. Please.
It's important. It's important.
I'm sorry, we don't have time. The next side event is outside and we need to accommodate for them. I'm sorry.